Hello, welcome to another video from alpacaguild.com. Over the next series of videos we're going to be talking a lot about fences, new fences, replacing fences, perhaps using fences to create channels or races so that we can actually guide our alpaca through them. For whatever sort of fence we might be looking for though, there's an essential and common component, and that is the wooden posts at each end. These specifically are the strainers and the stays, and there are a number of different ways that we can make these, and they all have their own purposes. So what we're going to do now is have a look around the farm here and just identify some of the different types and when we might or might not use them. Let's go and take a look. So here we've got a number 1 round. This is a substantial post. The reason that we've chosen this is there is considerable force put on it by the wires when they're under tension. Because of the angle of the land that we're on here, the strainer doesn't need to be at a particularly sharp angle, but it's distributing that load into a foot at the end, which is of course buried into the ground. So a lot of force can be pushed in that direction without this post going anywhere. There are a couple of issues that we need to consider when we've got a fence line that has many curves in it, and that is the tension or the force, the friction that we're going to find on these wires as we tighten them up. And we've got a couple of tricks just to allow them to move freely as we're doing that. But essentially in an area like this where we really need to have considerable force, we've gone for a number 1, which would normally be seen at the end of one of these fence lines. So what we do here to allow the wire to move just while we're putting it under tension is we take a couple of staples, knock them in a little way and bend them over, and then put a staple between the 2 legs of the original staple for the wire to go through. That just allows for a little bit of movement with a lot less friction than if this wire was up against the wood directly. Okay, so what we've got here is a very different type of assembly. In this one, we're not actually distributing the load directly into the ground through a single piece of wood. Instead, we've got this sort of H shape with a diagonal strainer wire between them. Now, the principles are quite simple. Where the wood joins here, let's think of that as a point of pivot, the same at this end too. And these 2 verticals would in theory move together. The metal that runs between them at an angle is ensuring that that cannot happen in one direction. Essentially any force on this post in that direction is going to result in this top piece of wood wanting to travel in that direction, something that this wire is trying to stop. What we've ended up doing here is essentially distributing the force into essentially trying to pull the bottom across. So this wants to stay perfectly vertical. As we try to push across, it is the force against this and against the soil that is actually stopping it from moving. So rather than it twisting in the ground or leaning within the ground, it's trying to move itself horizontally against the ground. And of course, given that a substantial amount of wood in the ground here, that's not going to happen. It's going to stay exactly where it is. Now there are different types that we can do here depending on how much strain we want to put on them. This is a relatively large-ish post. This is a number 2. It's not one of our strongest ones here. We don't need it because this angle isn't particularly steep and we haven't even started to put the tension on it yet. So this assembly is ideal for taking the amount of strain that will be put onto it by these wires. Okay, so what we have here is an incredibly simple, quite traditional form of fence, stay and strainer assembly. We have our verticals. The load is being distributed down this diagonal post into the ground where there is a foot at the end. All that force is coming down against the soil that of course has been compacted in and doesn't want to move. So the fence line between these 2, there's one at the other end, can be nice and tight and it'll be impenetrable to the animals that we're keeping either side of it. In this particular case, we want to keep our alpacas on this side, but we have had incidents where other animals from neighbouring farms get into this side. So we've tried to put up a different type of fence here. It's a net which is tied onto this, so regardless of what might appear this side of the fence, it's not going to get through. This side, of course, we're under control. We know exactly what we're going to have in here. This fence assembly type is also excellent at holding the weight of a gate. We've got a gate on here. It's quite a substantial one. It's 4 meters long. It's heavy, and all the strain that goes on here wants to take it in that direction. Of course, this post is trying to prevent strain coming from that direction, but it's the strainer at the other end that is going to do that work of carrying the weight of the gate. So on a fence line like this, which can be very short or very long, this one's actually quite a short one, we take the gate's weight and we make sure that it's picked up by the assembly at the other end. Okay, a couple of key things to call out here. One, you'll notice we have an old fence here and a new fence. There's a number of reasons for this. We're actually creating a boundary barrier. This isn't one of our perimeter fences. This is actually a woodlands that belongs to us, and we're really just trying to keep that into a sort of a natural habitat. We don't want any animals being in there. It's had about 10 years, I believe, of cows in there before I had this property. They had really decimated some of the natural wildlife. So we're just letting that go back to what it needs to be. We're putting in a couple of native plants, but essentially that's out of bounds to the animals. This old fence wasn't particularly robust, and we didn't really like where it was in some places. It was a little bit close to a cliff edge, so we decided to put in a nice new fence here. But it is a good call out, because where we do have our perimeter fences, we actually have a 4-meter gap between the perimeter and our internal fences. At no point, therefore, are our animals able to come anywhere within 4 meters of a perimeter fence. That's especially important if you're concerned about your alpaca perhaps being fed by passers-by who may not understand the kind of plants that could be toxic to them, and also if you find that your animals do break through your fence, and I'm sure if you're doing a good fence that's not going to be an issue, but if it does happen, you've got a second line of defence here as well. So a double fence line is a really important thing in my mind, to protect the animals from themselves and from others. So another call out here about these box sections. In this particular area, we're a little bit concerned about the strength of the ground. As I said earlier, we are next to a sort of a cliff face here. It does start to fall away. You may be able to hear there's some water in the background. That is eroding some of the soil. So we didn't want to rely on a standard diagonal with a foot at the bottom, where the soil might start to erode and it might start to weaken the fence. As you might be able to see here, this is also another number one. This is a very substantial one because this is actually a long fence line, and it's actually got quite a sharp angle. So there's a lot of tension going against this. Now the other great thing about these boxes is the force, rather than going at an angle and being fairly shallow into the ground, this one goes directly down, and these can be as long as you need them to be. In fact, this post at this end is as long as the one sticking out of the ground. So there's at least another metre, 3 feet or so of this going into the ground than there is on here. We might be talking a good 5 feet, maybe 1.5 metre into the ground. That's a substantial amount, with a footing at the bottom as well. Now if you can't dig a hole that's large enough for a large foot to go that far down, then you can put in some other rocks and other things that would just distribute the weight at the bottom. But essentially on this assembly, we have incredible strength going straight down. We have no concerns about any erosion to the soil, and yet we still create a strainer assembly box. We're using a number one that provides all that tension and the resistance of the tension that we want to get on this particular fence line. So another significant wooden assembly that you might have in a fence line is one of these. So this is a storm gate, and this is where you might want to span something like a small stream or river in such a way that you don't want animals to be able to pass through it. So it's got to be as good and reliable as a normal fence. But if for any reason we had a particular downpour, the 1 in 100 year kind of storm where we might see a lot of debris, tree roots, etc. coming down this stream, then we want something that's going to be able to break, let that pass through, and then be fixed, reassembled, replaced later, but isn't going to take some of our fence with it. So this is using some fairly standard 4x2 or 50 by 200 mil timbers. They're treated. It's a relatively strong structure if an animal were to sort of push against it, but we know that it would break, it would come disconnected from the fence posts at each side if something really substantial like a big tree trunk came down. Now, we say 1 in 100 years. In the 5 years that I've been on this property, we have had this stream rise 2 meters. And it did take some quite substantial things with it, including 2 of my bridges. So these things are needed for situations like that. Of course, for the rest of the time, they do a fantastic job of just ensuring animals don't come through. Now, as I said earlier, we don't actually allow our animals to go next to the perimeter fence line, so we don't allow them here. We also keep them away from the stream, and in the time that we've been at this property, this stream has really become crystal clear. When it used to have cows on here, this was pretty muddy all the time, and certainly it affected some of the downstream properties. So we're just trying to let the wildlife get this area back. And even though our animals don't come down here, we want to make sure that this is here to prevent other animals coming onto the property. So here is another quite creative way of making these box type structures. What we've done here is we've gone with the horizontal wood quite high up. In fact, we've done that on most of our boxes, although we have of course just had a look at some that are a little lower down. But this has created a triangle which means that the alpacas themselves can't reach in. They can reach up to this point, so this poor tree lucerne has actually been providing quite a lot of fodder to the alpacas and has taken a bit of a beating. It's taking a rest at the moment and they bounce back incredibly quickly, but it's certainly had a bit of a rough few weeks. But this shape here is really ideal, where we've got a couple of lines that are coming together. So essentially it's two boxes in isolation, one running down this way, one running across that way. But by putting these timbers here, we can actually start to hang things on it, whether that's a water trough or some sort of hay basket or other feeders. So it's an incredibly useful way of taking what needs to be put at the end of some fence lines and turning it into a sort of multi-purpose type of setup here. Now the alternative, of course, would have been a single vertical post at one end, diagonal into the ground. It would have done the job, but it wouldn't have given you any of this flexibility. So with a little extra timber and a few more hours of digging, we've actually got a really useful combination of different systems that we can do. And we're starting to put these around the farm wherever we have lines come together that are at that sort of acute angle. We'll be seeing some of those later in some of the new fence setups that we're going to be videoing. Hey, but this is an Alpaca Guild video, so it wouldn't be right for us to leave at this point without having some close-up with some alpacas. It's feeding time, so let's go and see how they're doing today. Always the first, aren't you, Miss Moneypenny? There we are, girls. Yes, you may have noticed we have a little cria with us today too. She was born just 6 days ago. It's amazing, within 24-48 hours, up and running around the paddock. Yeah, she's been very well welcomed into the herd by the other girls. What a mess that is.